Hello, this is a video about whether state building in the 16th and 17th centuries played a contributing role to the increase in witch hunting in the same period. So an obvious place to start is what is meant by state building when historians talk about it. Well, really the following things. In this period, rulers all over Europe were trying to ensure that they had stronger control over the areas that they ruled. So that might mean improving the bureaucracy, the administration of a territory, controlling it more from the centre, centralisation. That might mean so you're getting better, more efficient at collecting taxes, that kind of thing. But it also had legal implications as well. So if you're the ruler of a country and you wanted to centralise the legal system, it meant you wanted to have a tighter control over the courts and the laws of the land. And so there was no difference what was going on in some local areas to what was going on in others. It was controlled by the centre. And part of that, increasingly, was that the court systems in countries, the courts themselves, were secular rather than ecclesiastical, rather than church-controlled courts. So rulers were taking more control over the administration of justice. And the other thing that rulers wanted was religious conformity, everybody singing from the same hymn sheet, if you like. So that's what state building was in the 16th, 17th centuries. It's going on a lot. And because it's running at the same time, it's contemporary with this increase in witch hunting, some historians have said, yeah, there's a connection. But is there? So a good place to start is to look at France, because France was a good example of a country that had been subject to state building. It was a centralised state. The kings of France had been very keen to increase their control and authority over the local regions. And as a result, France, by the 16th and 17th centuries, probably the most centralised state in Europe. And yet, look, relatively low persecution of witches. Now, if you imagine France being divided up into 9 different areas, each provincial area was under the legal control of a parliament. So there were 9 parliaments, and under each parliament were lots of local courts and local magistrates. But the parliament was the supreme court for that area of France, a higher court. And perhaps the most important of these courts was the Paris Parliament. It dealt with the largest number of witchcraft cases in all of France, and it covered most of the provinces in the north of France itself. Now, a really good example to have up your sleeve is what happened in the years 1588 to 1624. This is sort of like peak witch hunting time across Western Europe generally. Now, during that time, all cases of witchcraft that were dealt with in local courts and carried the death penalty, in other words, capital witchcraft cases, had to be automatically appealed up to the Paris Parliament, who review the judgment. And when they reviewed these judgments, they only confirmed 24% of them. So over 3/4 of these judgments in the local courts on witchcraft were rejected by the Paris Parliament. So this is what we call appellate jurisdiction, where you have local courts and then there is a right to appeal, or a process to appeal the judgment to a higher court. That's appellate jurisdiction, that's what that's called. And that appellate jurisdiction effectively put the brakes on there being bigger witch hunts in France. And this is because the judges in the parliaments themselves were able to resist the pressure that came from a local level sometimes to execute witches. They rejected confessions made under torture. They said that's not good enough proof. They were better trained than the local magistrates in the local courts. They demanded higher standards of proof. They took a close look at the process of each case, the documents, and if there was a problem with the process, the way that the case had been carried out, then they would knock it down. And perhaps the biggest reason that they didn't feel pressurised is that these are judges well away from these local, these small provincial areas. They're not subject to the same village tensions and the local fears about the one-legged lady who turns your butter bad, that kind of thing. And because they're remote from that, they're more objective. They can take a, if you like, a more objective view, nuanced view, if you like. So in this situation, what we've got is the most centralised state in Europe, where state building's gone on a long time, and yet there's no connection to increased witch hunting. In fact, the connection is it's a decrease in witch hunting as a result of this state building, this increased state control. So another good example to look at here is England, just across the channel from France. Probably less centralised than France. There'd been less state building in England. It wasn't quite as far along the road as France was. We weren't quite so good at collecting taxes, that kind of thing. But we did have a highly centralised and closely state-controlled legal system. And there was very little persecution of witches generally. Now, most witchcraft cases were dealt with by what we call the assize courts. So let's imagine all the different counties in England. They all had their own local courts, obviously, but these different counties were grouped into circuits. So multiple counties that would be visited by 2 judges twice a year, sent from the government based in London, and these judges would travel around their circuit of counties to hear the cases, the serious cases generated by the local courts. And assize judges were senior judges. They had extensive legal experience. They were based in London. They were royally appointed. They're not local. They're not involved in those local superstitions or power struggles or animosities or village tensions or any of that. They're better educated than the local judges, the local magistrates. And crucially, they are against the idea of using torture. So that's the English system, England and Wales, for most of the 16th and 17th century. And during the 16th and 17th centuries, there were very few executions for witchcraft compared to other countries of a similar population. And we know that this central control of the legal system, this state building that's led to this central control of the legal system, meant that there were fewer executions, because when that system of control broke down, you get a big witch hunt, which we did in East Anglia 1645 to 1647. Check out the video, it's really good. It's also one of your case studies. That began because assize judges could not get to East Anglia to visit those counties to hear the witchcraft cases. If they had, they probably would have put the brakes on. Because the assize judges couldn't travel, because there was a war on, the witchcraft cases in those counties were dealt with by local magistrates, less well trained, more open to village superstition, etc., etc. And they called in the assistance of witch hunters like Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, and they did use torture methods or sleep deprivation, which is a form of torture, and not surprisingly that generated a lot of confessions, and there was a bit of a witch panic. Now, when the assize judges returned, they were highly critical. In 1647, they were highly critical of the methods Hopkins and Stern and the other local magistrates had used. They were critical of the process used, and the witch hunt was curtailed. It was stopped. So, if there's a breakdown in state control of the courts, centralised state control of the courts, you can sometimes get a witch hunt. Now, a really instructive example to have in any essay is Scotland as well, because Scotland, just across the border from England, in theory it's got, there's been some state building going on, it's got a centrally managed system of law, but actually that's what it looks like on paper. In practice, the control of the legal system in Scotland was quite weak. Control from the centre was weak. There literally weren't enough members of the judicial establishment. There weren't enough judges, magistrates, etc., etc., to really control the Scottish legal system in the way that was hoped. And there was a high persecution of witches. I mean, one of the highest in Europe. You think of the small population of Scotland, yet thousands of persecutions. Right, so the King of Scotland for an important part of this time was James VI. He had a personal interest in witches. You can see from that. Now, there were some witch panics in the 1590s, and the royal government of Scotland said, OK, if there are going to be any more witchcraft trials, these local courts have to get approval from the Privy Council, this is the Scottish government, or the Scottish Parliament. So local courts cannot have a witchcraft trial without the approval of the centre, if you like, royal authority. Now, that on paper sounds really good, doesn't it? That's central control of the legal system. In practice, because they did not have enough manpower to ensure this was done properly, the Privy Council and the Scottish Parliament would routinely grant permission to local magistrates to have witchcraft trials. They wouldn't really look at the paperwork. They didn't scrutinise it very carefully. So the government failed to notice and failed to act when a lot of local courts were asking to proceed against witches. Now, someone should have said, hang on a minute, this shouldn't be going on. But because they didn't have the time or the manpower, they were just waving these things through. They were routinely giving permission. So in practice, the system wasn't particularly centralised. Control from the centre was ineffective. So local courts and magistrates proceeded, because they're waved through, they're given this permission, and not surprisingly, they're less well trained, etc., etc. They had very high conviction rates and execution rates for suspected witches. Local magistrates lacked training. Local magistrates were exposed to these local fears and tensions about witches, and suspects could not appeal to any higher court. So it's not like they can appeal to a parliament like in Paris. They can't appeal to the assize judges like in England. There's no right of appeal. So Brian Levac sums this up really well. He says, Scotland, therefore, stands as an example of how a relatively weak state, strong on paper, weak in practice, with a small judicial establishment, had difficulty guaranteeing due process in the great majority of cases. In other words, Scotland looked like it had a strong centralised system, but it didn't in practice, and people weren't given a fair trial. So now let's look at another area of intense witch hunting, highly decentralised area, the Holy Roman Empire. We know that this was nominally under the control of the Holy Roman Emperor, but there were over 1,000 states, 400 German-speaking areas within those 1,000 states. Lots of freedoms to do your own thing, really, in each of those territories. And so severe persecution of witches, weak control from the centre, state building not really happening in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, there is a legal code, the Carolina, which everybody's supposed to follow, but each territory had its own autonomous courts, which meant that even very small areas ran their own courts. So effectively, they could ignore this centrally written legal code. And there were no judges, like assize judges or anything like that, travelling around to make sure these local courts were following the Carolina Code. And there were also no procedures to appeal to a higher court to get your case looked at again. So the judges in these smaller states especially were often really not particularly well trained. They relied very heavily on confession, and so they used torture a lot. They were allowed to use torture. That was open to abuse. And these local judges, they're part of the community. They are subjected to the fears about witches and the village tensions. And because there's no right to appeal, if you get sort of caught up in this web, if you're accused of being a witch, you've got no way of getting your case looked at again. So there were many more executions, many more convictions. Now, in some of the bigger states in the Holy Roman Empire, where there was a more centrally controlled system, where the state had more power, there were fewer witch hunts. So a good case to look at is Bavaria, big state, and they were better able in Bavaria to control their local courts. In Bohemia and Austria, where these governments had a stronger grip on the legal system, there were no major witch hunts. And in the cities like Prague and Vienna, much more centralised, these became a place where if you'd been accused of being a witch in some of the smaller states, if you managed to escape, well done for doing that, you could seek refuge in these places because they were much more sceptical and much more or much less likely to accuse people of witchcraft. So where does this leave us then? State building, central control. Well, areas with highly centralised legal systems rarely had large-scale witch hunts. France, England had highly centralised court systems which the state had put into place. The state wanted to control the courts better. Because of that, there were higher courts that people could appeal to, which meant lower conviction and execution rates. The worst witch hunting takes place where there hasn't been a lot of state building going on, in areas of decentralised political and legal authority. So we're talking about Scotland, which is strong on paper, weak in practice. The German-speaking states in the Holy Roman Empire, they lacked this central state control. Local magistrates have more power, so you've got higher rates of execution. And in areas where you did have centralised legal control, but if that broke down, you could still get witch hunts. So good example here, England during the Civil War and the East Anglian Hunt. In France, there was a big witch hunt in the Champagne-Ardenne area in the 16th century, and that was when locals took matters into their own hands. But because France had this strong centralised system of parliaments, when the parliament got involved, they restored control, they criticised the local magistrates, and they ended the witch hunt. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a rough idea whether state building was a key factor in the witch hunts, and it would appear based on this that the answer is not particularly. So how does Brian Levac sum it all up? Well, more clearly than I can. It is misleading to establish a general correlation between state building and witch hunting. One reason for calling the connection into question is that the central or higher courts of most European countries, those that most directly represented the authority of the state, did more to restrict witch hunting than to encourage it. These same central authorities were also primarily responsible for bringing witch hunting to an end. Cheers, Brian Levac. Couldn't have said it better myself.